In the summer of 1859, at the edge of the Gulf where Galveston's harbor breathes salt and suffering into the air, a man was placed on an auction block who should never have been there, not because he was innocent, but because his mine was too dangerous to be owned. Buyers would later swear that when he looked at them, it felt as though he was measuring them. No chains could quiet his questions, no price could define his worth, and no ledger could explain why, decades later, his name would vanish from every official record, leaving behind only whispers, contradictions, and an impossible mystery that the slave trade itself seemed desperate to forget. In the summer of 1859, when Galveston's harbor pulsed like a living artery of commerce and cruelty, the city believed it understood the rules of power better than any other port on the Gulf. Because here, men were reduced to numbers, women to line items, and intelligence itself was supposed to be something that could be beaten, starved, or sold away without consequence. Yet on a humid morning thick with the smell of salt, iron, and fear, something occurred that would quietly fracture that illusion, beginning not with violence or rebellion, but with observation, because when the man later recorded only as Isaac was marched onto the auction platform, shackled but upright, the first thing the crowd noticed was not his height or his scars or the dull resignation expected of a man who had crossed water in chains, but his eyes, which moved deliberately across the gathered buyers, not in panic or desperation, but in calculation, as though he were not the object of sale, but an accountant assessing assets, and this alone unsettled the space, because submission had a posture, and Isaac did not perform it, and the auctioneer, sensing discomfort ripple outward, cleared his throat and raised his voice, listing age, strength, and condition, as if reciting scripture. Yet even before the bidding began, murmurs spread through the dockside crowd that this man was different, because earlier that morning a shipping clerk had attempted to log him incorrectly, and Isaac, without raising his voice, had corrected the date of departure, the number of souls on board, and the discrepancy between cargo weight and recorded manifests, a correction that proved precise when checked. And from that moment, dock workers began whispering not about his strength, but his mind, which in the economy of slavery was more dangerous than any weapon. And as Isaac stood there listening to the auctioneer mispronounce his assigned name, he noticed details others ignored: the tremor in one buyer's hand that suggested debt, the expensive boots on another that implied inherited wealth, the way certain men avoided his gaze entirely, instinctively aware that being seen by someone they owned felt wrong, and when the auctioneer called for opening bids, a planter from inland Texas laughed and shouted a low price, confident that intelligence could be disciplined like muscle. But before the gavel could strike, Isaac spoke, not loudly, not angrily, but clearly enough that the nearest men heard him ask whether the buyer was aware that his existing liens would legally transfer to newly acquired property under Texas statutes if the purchase was recorded before harvest season, and the laughter stopped instantly, because the question revealed knowledge no enslaved man was supposed to possess, and the auctioneer slammed the gavel down not to accept a bid but to restore order, shouting for silence, threatening punishment. Yet the damage was already done, because in that brief moment Isaac had reminded everyone present that knowledge moved independently of chains, and the crowd shifted, some stepping back as if intelligence were contagious, others leaning forward with sharpened interest, believing a clever slave could be exploited for profit, not realizing that exploitation cuts both ways when the exploited understands the system better than the exploiter. As the bidding resumed, lower than expected, cautious, hesitant, Isaac remained silent, absorbing everything, memorizing faces, voices, power dynamics, because survival for him had never been about resistance in the way white men imagined it, but about comprehension, about learning how the machine functioned well enough to survive its turning gears. And when he was finally sold for a price that insulted even the brutal standards of the trade, his buyer convinced himself he had acquired a rare tool, a mind sharpened for his benefit. Unaware that tools wear down the hands that misuse them, and as Isaac was led away from the platform, he passed other enslaved men and women whose eyes followed him not with hope but with unease, because difference in such places attracted attention, and attention often invited punishment. Yet Isaac's presence lingered like an unanswered question long after the crowd dispersed, because that night in Galveston taverns, men spoke not of profit margins or cotton yields, but of a slave who spoke like a bookkeeper and looked like a judge, and some laughed it off as coincidence, while others drank in silence, unsettled by the sensation that the hierarchy they relied on might not be as natural as they pretended. And somewhere in the city records office, a clerk hesitated before finalizing Isaac's paperwork, making a minor alteration that would later become the first crack in the paper trail meant to erase him, and from that moment forward, Isaac ceased to be merely a man in bondage and became instead a problem to be managed. A variable the system could not easily account for, because slavery depended on predictability, and Isaac introduced uncertainty. And if you're still with this story, if you want to follow how one man's intelligence quietly destabilized everything he touched, make sure you subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon, and leave a comment telling us how this opening chapter made you feel, because this was only the beginning, and what followed would force Galveston, and history itself, to confront a truth it was never prepared to face. By the time Isaac was carried inland from Galveston, shackled to a wagon whose wheels groaned like tired animals, the city had already begun to forget him, in the way places built on transactions forget the faces behind the numbers. Yet Isaac did not forget the city, because he understood that memory was a weapon sharper than any blade, and he catalogued every mile of road, every river crossing, every change in soil color as they moved toward the plantation that now claimed him, a sprawling cotton operation owned by a man named Caleb Rourke, whose reputation preceded him as a collector of useful men rather than a brute destroyer of bodies. And it was this reputation that convinced Rourke he had made a clever purchase, because he believed intelligence could be harnessed like a mule, fed just enough to keep it productive, beaten only when necessary. And from the moment Isaac arrived, Rourke began testing him not with whips or chains, but with questions disguised as commands, asking him to count bales, to calculate rations, to copy ledgers late into the night under the pretense of clerical assistance. And Isaac complied without protest, because he understood the oldest truth of captivity, that visibility without resistance creates the illusion of control while quietly transferring power to the observer. And as days turned into weeks, Isaac learned the plantation's rhythms more intimately than the overseer ever had, discovering how deliveries were padded, how accounts were falsified to conceal theft from creditors, how the timing of labor rotations revealed where Rourke hid his private reserves, and all the while Rourke congratulated himself on his acquisition, boasting to neighboring planters that he had found a slave who could add columns faster than a trained clerk, unaware that Isaac was not merely adding numbers, but mapping a system designed to eat itself. It was during one such evening, as Isaac sat beneath a flickering lamp copying figures he already knew were false, that he noticed the quiet fear that lived just beneath Rourke's confidence, a fear rooted not in rebellion, but exposure, because men who profited from lies feared truth more than violence, and Isaac's presence represented truth in its most dangerous form, the kind that could articulate itself, and this fear manifested subtly at first, longer stares, sudden silences, the way Rourke's wife refused to be alone in the room when Isaac worked, as though intellect carried contagion, and then more overtly when the overseer began issuing contradictory orders meant to confuse him, to trip him into error, because a mistake would restore the natural order in which white men believed themselves superior by default. Yet Isaac made none, and instead he corrected them politely, deferentially, every correction tightening the knot of unease around the plantation's hierarchy, because it forced those in power to confront a contradiction they could not resolve, that the man they owned understood their world better than they did. And this contradiction infected the enslaved community as well, who watched Isaac carefully, some with admiration, others with fear, because exceptional men attracted exceptional punishments, and Isaac knew this too, which is why he never spoke of escape, never whispered plans, never gathered followers, choosing instead to let his influence seep quietly into the cracks of daily life, teaching a young field hand to count using seeds, correcting a woman's ledger tally when she was accused of theft, slipping small truths into conversations that reminded others their minds were not broken even if their bodies were constrained, And it was this subtle spreading of awareness that truly endangered him, because systems of domination collapse not from force but from comprehension. And when Rourke discovered that discrepancies in his accounts were no longer working in his favor, that creditors were asking sharper questions, that neighboring planters were suddenly less trusting of his numbers, he looked not at himself but at Isaac, and suspicion hardened into paranoia, because it was easier to believe one enslaved man was sabotaging him than to accept that the structure he relied upon was inherently unstable. And so Rourke began isolating Isaac, removing him from communal spaces, locking him in a small office at night under the guise of protection, telling himself he was safeguarding an asset while actually responding to the terror of losing control. And in that isolation, Isaac learned something even more dangerous than accounting. He learned the plantation's legal vulnerabilities, because Rourke, confident in his dominance, left documents unsecured, wills unfinished, manumission drafts half-written and abandoned, and Isaac read them all, not with hope but with clarity, understanding that freedom was rarely granted but sometimes misfiled, and as weeks stretched into months, Rourke's fixation deepened into obsession, because Isaac's intelligence no longer felt useful but threatening, a mirror held too close, reflecting not mastery but dependence. And one night, after a heated argument with a visiting investor who questioned his figures, Rourke struck Isaac for the first time, not out of cruelty but panic, because violence was the language men used when words failed them, and Isaac accepted the blow without resistance, without defiance, because he understood that fear had finally crossed the threshold into desperation, and desperation makes mistakes. And as Isaac lay awake that night on a narrow cot, listening to the plantation settle into uneasy sleep, he realized that the danger was no longer surviving captivity, but surviving usefulness, because a mind that cannot be controlled must eventually be destroyed. And yet even then, even as the walls closed tighter, Isaac did not plan escape, because he was beginning to see something far more unsettling than the possibility of freedom. He was beginning to see how deeply the system depended on men like him remaining invisible, and how powerful it would be if he refused to disappear. And if this story is pulling you deeper, if you can feel the tension tightening around a man whose greatest crime was understanding the world too well, stay with us, because what came next would transform suspicion into open fear, and intelligence into something Galveston and its plantations would never forgive. By the time Caleb Rourke's fear hardened into something colder and more deliberate, Isaac understood that the plantation had entered a new phase, one where intelligence was no longer an asset to be exploited, but a liability to be neutralized. And this shift revealed itself not through louder cruelty, but through silence, through the way conversations stopped when Isaac entered a room, through the way overseers suddenly received sealed instructions instead of spoken orders, through the way Rourke began watching from doorways rather than commanding from porches, because men who fear exposure prefer observation to authority, and Isaac, ever attentive, recognized the pattern immediately, recognizing too that his survival now depended not on usefulness but on ambiguity, because clarity made men like Rourke feel naked, and naked men reached for knives. And so Isaac began to dull the sharp edges of his brilliance without extinguishing it, introducing small, harmless errors that could be corrected later, asking questions he already knew the answers to, lowering expectations just enough to make himself tolerable again. Yet even this calculated dimming only confirmed Rourke's deepest suspicion, because a man who could choose when to be intelligent was more terrifying than one who could not help it. And whispers began circulating beyond Belle Rive Plantation, carried by traders and clerks who had crossed paths with Isaac in Galveston, and now heard rumors of a slave who could read legal codes, who could speak 3 languages, who corrected white men without raising his voice, and in a society built on the lie of black inferiority. Such rumors were not curiosities but threats, and soon a visitor arrived whose presence changed everything, a self-styled phrenologist from New Orleans, invited by Rourke under the pretense of scientific curiosity, but driven by a darker motive, because men of science in that era often served as executioners in clean coats, their measurements and classifications, providing moral cover for brutality, and when the phrenologist examined Isaac, pressing calipers against his skull, asking him riddles and logic puzzles, while scribbling notes with trembling excitement, Isaac answered calmly, precisely, knowing that every correct response pushed him further from safety, yet refusing to lie, because he had learned that denying truth never saved anyone, it only delayed punishment, and the man's conclusions were exactly what Rourke both wanted and feared, that Isaac was an anomaly, a statistical impossibility, a living contradiction to racial doctrine, and anomalies, in the language of science, were not preserved but eliminated to protect the model. And from that moment, the plantation shifted again, moving from suspicion into preparation, as Rourke quietly contacted authorities, framing Isaac not as dangerous but unstable, suggesting that his intelligence bordered on madness, that he might incite unrest, that his mind was unfit for proximity to others, and this narrative, so carefully constructed, found eager listeners among men whose own status relied on unquestioned hierarchy, because nothing terrified the antebellum South more than the possibility that its foundations were intellectually indefensible. And while papers were filed and letters exchanged, Isaac sensed the tightening net and began doing something extraordinary. He started teaching history, not openly, not formally, but through stories whispered, "I," in the dark, through parables woven into work songs, through metaphors that carried dates, names, and truths disguised as folklore, because if his body was to be erased, his knowledge would not go quietly, and the enslaved community listened with a hunger that frightened them as much as it sustained them, because learning reminded them of what had been taken. And yet Isaac never spoke of rebellion, never named escape routes, never gave instructions that could be punished as insurrection. Understanding that survival sometimes required playing within the margins of legality while hollowing it out from the inside, and it was this restraint that made his eventual removal all the more devastating, because one morning he was simply gone, taken before dawn under guard, transported not to another plantation but to a county holding facility where he was labeled unsound, a term flexible enough to justify anything. And Rourke told the remaining enslaved people that Isaac had been sold, that his usefulness had run its course. Yet the lie rang hollow, because no ledger reflected the transaction, no trader claimed the purchase, and when months passed without word, fear settled into the soil like rot, and Isaac's own experience during this disappearance was something few records captured and fewer survived to tell, because he was moved between locations deliberately unmarked, examined by men who asked him the same questions over and over, hoping repetition would expose inconsistency, hoping exhaustion would crack him open and reveal madness where there was only clarity, and each time he answered patiently, precisely, not to prove himself, but to deny them the satisfaction of reduction, and this frustrated them deeply, because their entire project depended on finding flaws, and when flaws did not appear, they resorted to isolation, believing that solitude would unmake him, unaware that Isaac's mind had already learned to inhabit itself fully, that he had memorized entire books in his youth, that he could reconstruct arguments internally without paper or ink. And it was in this enforced solitude that Isaac reached a terrifying conclusion, that his intelligence was not an accident but a responsibility, that he existed not merely to survive but to demonstrate by his very being the lie at the heart of American slavery, and this realization gave him a calm that unnerved his captors, because men accustomed to fear could not understand acceptance without surrender, and eventually, as costs mounted and patience wore thin, the decision was made to return Isaac to Galveston under the guise of resale, a quiet reset meant to erase the problem rather than confront it. But Galveston was no longer the same place it had been months earlier, because rumors had arrived before him, whispers of a man whose mind could not be contained, and when Isaac stepped once more onto the docks, thinner but unbroken, he sensed that the final stage of his journey was beginning, one that would force the city, and the system it served, to choose between erasure and exposure. And if you feel the story tightening, if you sense that the world around Isaac is preparing to either silence him forever or unleash consequences it cannot control, stay with us, because what happens next is where intelligence stops being merely dangerous and becomes revolutionary. When Isaac returned to Galveston, the city greeted him not with chains alone but with recognition, and that recognition was far more dangerous, because anonymity had once been his only shield, and now even dock workers who pretended not to notice him carried rumors in their silence, glancing twice, whispering his name only when they thought the wind would steal it away. For Galveston, 1859, was not merely a port, but a listening organism, a place where news moved faster than ships and truth traveled disguised as gossip, and Isaac felt it immediately, the way eyes followed him without hostility, yet without kindness either, the way. Questions lingered unsaid in the air around him, and this attention unsettled the men who claimed ownership over him more than any act of defiance ever could, because power relies on invisibility as much as obedience, and Isaac was becoming impossible to ignore. The trader who handled his reappearance tried to present him as damaged goods, emphasizing the months of unsoundness, the supposed instability, yet every interaction betrayed the lie, because Isaac spoke with clarity, with patience, with a composure that unsettled potential buyers who expected either brokenness or rage, and when they tested him, as they always did, by asking him to count, to measure, to solve simple problems meant to reinforce hierarchy, Isaac answered carefully, offering competence without brilliance, enough to demonstrate usefulness but not enough to provoke fear, and for a brief moment it seemed the strategy might succeed, that he might disappear again into labor and survival, but Galveston itself refused to let that happen, because this city, unlike the isolated plantations, was a crossroads of ideas as well as goods, and among its population were men who read newspapers from the north, who traded with foreigners, who encountered black sailors fluent in multiple languages, men who understood that intelligence was not as rare as slaveholders claimed, and when these men observed Isaac, when they heard him negotiate prices in his head faster than clerks could write them down, when they saw him correct weights without touching a scale, something shifted, because Isaac did not appear miraculous, he appeared familiar, and that familiarity was far more destabilizing and genius, because it suggested not exception but pattern. The trader's frustration grew as days passed without a sale, each failed negotiation reinforcing the sense that Isaac was too visible to be owned quietly, and in response, Isaac was assigned temporary labor along the docks, a decision meant to extract value while waiting for interest. Yet this proximity to ships and sailors placed him directly within a network of people who recognized knowledge as currency, and soon Isaac found himself engaged in subtle exchanges, translating a phrase here, correcting a manifest there, helping a free black dockhand calculate wages owed, never asserting authority, never lingering long enough to attract suspicion, but each interaction layered another strand of connection around him, and it was through these strands that his reputation solidified into something more dangerous than rumor, because people began to trust him, and trust, in a society built on enforced ignorance, was revolutionary. Word reached local officials that a troublesome slave had returned to the city, one whose intellect had already caused administrative complications, and meetings were held not to address him directly, but to discuss how best to contain the narrative surrounding him, because by now the fear was no longer that Isaac might escape or rebel, but that he might be observed too closely, that his existence might invite questions that led nowhere safe, and so a plan formed quietly, as such plans always did, to remove him once more, this time permanently, not through sale but through disappearance, justified by bureaucratic language that masked intent behind procedure, and Isaac, perceptive as ever, sensed the tightening of options, yet rather than retreat inward, he expanded outward, beginning to leave behind fragments of himself deliberately, teaching a dockboy how to read numbers by scratching equations into the dirt, explaining navigational stars to a sailor's son, correcting a misquoted law for a free black carpenter who had been cheated out of pay, not because he believed these acts would save him, but because he understood that legacy was not built through monuments, but through continuity, and if he could not remain, his knowledge would. The moment of confrontation arrived not with violence, but with formality, when Isaac was summoned before a small panel of city men who questioned him politely, almost respectfully, about his origins, his education, his movements, their tone one of curiosity tinged with caution, and Isaac answered honestly but selectively, offering no lies yet revealing no vulnerabilities, and it was this balance that frustrated them most, because they could find no justification for punishment without admitting fear, and fear, once admitted, exposed the lie beneath authority, and so they postponed action, a delay that allowed Isaac one final, crucial act, for during this uncertain window he encountered a man whose significance would not be understood until much later, a northern merchant sympathetic to abolitionist ideas, who recognized Isaac not as property but as a mind trapped in a system allergic to thought, and their conversation, brief and seemingly innocuous, planted the seed of a possibility neither dared to name, because escape was not merely a physical act, but an intellectual gamble, and Isaac knew that leaving without leaving traces would erase him entirely, while staying risked destruction, and it was within this tension that he made his choice, not yet acted upon but fully formed, as the city closed around him with polite menace, as orders were drafted and signatures prepared, as the machinery of erasure revved quietly into motion, unaware that the man it sought to silence had already begun to outpace it. And as Part 4 draws to its close, understand this: Galveston had seen Isaac, truly seen him, and once a system is seen clearly, it cannot pretend ignorance again, and what follows is not simply a story of survival, but of consequence, because when intelligence is forced into the shadows, it does not disappear, it reorganizes. What Isaac did next was neither sudden nor dramatic, but it was deliberate, and deliberateness was the most dangerous form of resistance in a world that relied on reaction, because, once the possibility of his removal became inevitable rather than hypothetical, Isaac stopped thinking in terms of days and began thinking in terms of transmission, understanding that escape, if it came, would be only one outcome among many, while preservation of truth was the larger task, and so he began moving through Galveston with a quiet urgency that appeared to others as calm resignation, continuing his dock work, continuing his small exchanges, yet now each interaction carried weight, each word chosen not merely for clarity, but for endurance, because Isaac understood that systems collapse slowly, but memory survives quickly if planted correctly, and in the weeks that followed, an informal network formed around him without any one person ever acknowledging its existence, composed of free black laborers, enslaved men hired out temporarily, sailors from the Caribbean who spoke in coded metaphors, and even a few white tradesmen whose curiosity outweighed their fear, and Isaac became the axis around which this network rotated, not as a leader issuing commands, but as a node of coherence, someone who could connect fragments of information into patterns others could use, and this frightened the authorities far more than open rebellion ever could, because rebellion justified violence, but coherence exposed incompetence. The city's officials began noticing subtle disruptions, dock schedules corrected before errors occurred, cargo tallies aligning too perfectly, disputes resolved without escalation, all signs of a mind smoothing chaos rather than creating it, and yet these efficiencies undermined the very justification for control, because if enslaved labor could function intelligently without oversight, then oversight was revealed as ornamental at best and parasitic at worst, and so scrutiny intensified, shadows lengthened, and Isaac felt eyes on him even when none were visible, yet he did not slow down, because slowing down would signal fear, and fear invited intervention. Instead, he began recording knowledge in unconventional ways, carving symbols into scrap wood that appeared decorative but encoded routes and schedules, teaching mathematical principles through rhythm and cadence that could be remembered without writing, embedding legal facts into biblical references that could pass unnoticed by those who assumed Scripture belonged exclusively to them, and each of these acts layered resilience into the community, creating redundancy so that no single removal could undo the whole. And it was during this period that Isaac's name, though never written, began circulating beyond Galveston, carried by sailors who spoke of the quiet one who knows, a phrase that crossed ports and plantations alike, unsettling men who depended on isolation to maintain dominance. The tipping point came not through exposure, but through overreach, when city officials, frustrated by their inability to justify action against Isaac without provoking questions they could not answer, attempted to fabricate an incident, accusing him of inciting unrest after a minor dispute escalated on the docks, and Isaac was detained briefly, questioned aggressively, yet released just as quickly when testimonies contradicted the accusation too neatly, because too many people had seen too much, and this failure marked a shift, because it revealed that the machinery of control was no longer functioning invisibly, that each action now generated scrutiny rather than compliance, and Isaac recognized the significance immediately, understanding that the system had crossed from confidence into panic, and panic produced mistakes. That night, under cover of routine labor, Isaac was approached again by the northern merchant he had met weeks earlier, a man who spoke carefully, who never used words like freedom or escape, yet whose meaning was unmistakable, offering Isaac a place on a vessel leaving within days, not as cargo or property, but as an assistant whose skills were valuable enough to justify documentation, a thin legal fiction that might hold long enough to cross jurisdictional lines, and Isaac listened without interrupting, weighing not only his own survival, but the consequences of departure, because leaving would protect his body, but risked dissolving the network he had helped stabilize, yet staying risked erasure that would dismantle it anyway, and it was this calculation, not fear, that guided his response, as he asked not whether escape was possible, but whether others could be protected if he took it. And the merchant, honest in a way that startled Isaac, admitted uncertainty, acknowledging that systems retaliated unpredictably when challenged, and this honesty solidified Isaac's decision, because uncertainty acknowledged truth rather than disguising it, and so plans began forming quietly, contingencies layered within contingencies, while Isaac continued his daily routines as if nothing had changed, because invisibility now required normalcy rather than silence. In these final days before the attempted departure, Isaac did something extraordinary. He began correcting the historical record in real time, telling stories of Africa not as myth but as context, recounting scientific principles that predated Europe, naming mathematicians and astronomers whose contributions had been stolen or erased, not to inspire rebellion, but to restore proportion, because knowing that oppression was constructed, not natural, altered the internal landscape of those who heard it, and this internal shift was irreversible. And when the night of departure arrived, Isaac walked to the docks under the same moon that had watched countless men disappear without trace. Yet this time something was different, because the city felt aware, tense, as if holding its breath, and though what followed would test every assumption Isaac held about survival, what matters now is this. By the end of Part 5, Isaac was no longer merely a man trying to live within a system designed to erase him. He had become a variable system could not account for, and when systems encounter variables they cannot model, collapse is no longer theoretical, it becomes inevitable. The night Isaac was meant to leave Galveston did not unfold with the secrecy he had imagined, because secrecy depended on ignorance, and ignorance had already been eroded by weeks of quiet coordination, and as he moved toward the docks beneath a sky heavy with coastal humidity, every sound seemed amplified, every footstep carrying consequence, not because he feared capture, but because he understood that moments like this were not singular events, but convergences of forces set in motion long before one man decided to walk away, and the city itself felt altered, as if aware that something irreversible was about to occur, and yet the streets were calm, almost deceptively so, because power rarely announces its mistakes until after they have been made. Isaac reached the vessel as planned, greeted not with ceremony but with routine, because routine was the strongest camouflage, and for a brief suspended moment it seemed possible that the system might simply fail to notice him slipping through its grasp, that the paperwork would hold just long enough, that jurisdictional confusion would do what moral reckoning never had, but systems built on domination rarely fail quietly, And somewhere between the final manifest check and the loosening of ropes, a discrepancy surfaced, not dramatic, not alarming in itself, just a question asked by the wrong man at the wrong time, and that question triggered a cascade of attention that had been waiting for an excuse to converge, and suddenly Isaac was surrounded not by guards but by process, by men invoking rules rather than threats, demanding clarification, documentation, verification, and Isaac answered each inquiry calmly, precisely, knowing that panic would validate their assumptions, while composure forced them to confront something they could not categorize, because enslaved men were not supposed to navigate bureaucracy with ease, and this dissonance slowed them down even as it confirmed their fears. The delay drew a crowd, dock workers lingering longer than necessary, sailors pretending to adjust lines while listening closely, and this collective attention altered the balance of power subtly but decisively, because violence thrives in isolation, and isolation had evaporated, and when an official finally attempted to assert authority by ordering Isaac detained pending review, the words rang hollow, because review of what, exactly, and by whom, and the lack of clarity exposed the fragility beneath the command, and in that moment Isaac understood that escape was no longer the sole objective, because something larger was unfolding, something that involved not movement but exposure. The argument escalated not in volume but in complexity, each side invoking statutes, precedents, exceptions, and Isaac, standing at the center, became both subject and witness, correcting misstatements quietly when necessary, not to antagonize but to clarify, and each correction drew murmurs from the crowd, because hearing a black man articulate the law that constrained him destabilized the performance of control, and the official, sensing authority slipping, made the fatal error of resorting to force too soon, grabbing Isaac's arm in a gesture meant to reassert hierarchy physically, what had been lost intellectually, and that gesture triggered reaction, not from Isaac, but from the crowd, a ripple of voices protesting not the injustice, but the breach of procedure, because procedure was the only shield many of them had, and the official, suddenly aware that he was no longer acting within the invisible consent of the system, released his grip, retreating into bluster. And it was in that fracture, that brief moment where the system hesitated, unsure of which mask to wear, that Isaac stepped back deliberately, not fleeing, not advancing, simply removing himself from the center of company, inflict, allowing the attention to diffuse, and in doing so he made himself momentarily invisible again, not as a slave but as a variable the system could not pin down. The vessel did not depart that night, nor was Isaac formally detained, because indecision had paralyzed action, and, as the crowd dispersed, unsettled but unpunished, Isaac melted back into the city, guided by hands that never acknowledged him directly, slipping into alleys and storerooms that had always existed but now served a purpose beyond commerce. And as dawn approached, Galveston awoke to rumors rather than arrests, questions rather than conclusions, and officials found themselves unable to explain what had happened without admitting that something had gone wrong. In the days that followed, the response was not immediate repression, but confusion, because no clear infraction had occurred, no riot, no escape, no crime that could be punished without scrutiny, and Isaac remained unaccounted for, neither openly present nor officially missing, existing in a liminal state that frustrated those who sought closure, and during this time he continued his work quietly, moving between safe spaces, reinforcing connections, correcting misinformation before it hardened into accusation, because he understood that the system's greatest vulnerability was its reliance on narrative coherence, and coherence was unraveling. The northern merchant departed alone, his role now ambiguous enough to avoid consequence, while whispers spread of a dockside incident that had ended not in bloodshed but embarrassment, a far more dangerous outcome for those invested in authority, and Isaac, observing from the margins, realized that his survival no longer depended on escape alone, but on persistence, on remaining present enough to complicate erasure without becoming visible enough to justify elimination, a balance as delicate as it was revolutionary. And as the city settled back into uneasy routine, Something had shifted irreversibly, because Galveston had witnessed a moment where the machinery of slavery hesitated, where intelligence disrupted inertia, and once a system reveals hesitation, it can never again claim inevitability. And Isaac, aware that the most dangerous phase was yet to come, prepared for the consequences of having forced that revelation, because what follows exposure is not collapse but retaliation. And in the final stretch of this story, the system will attempt to reassert itself not through ignorance, but through control, unaware that control over a mind already free is an illusion. And that is where Part 7 begins. In the weeks following the night the system hesitated, Galveston returned outwardly to its routines while inwardly tightening like a fist, because power, once embarrassed, does not forget, and the absence of a clear culprit made that embarrassment fester into something more dangerous than anger, calculation. And Isaac felt this shift immediately, not through open threats, but through subtle changes in the city's rhythm, in the way patrols lingered longer at corners where they once passed without thought, in how ledgers were suddenly reviewed with unusual diligence, in how men, who had once spoken freely, now measured their words as if the air itself had learned to listen. And Isaac understood that retaliation would not come as spectacle, but as correction, a quiet reassertion designed to restore the illusion that nothing had ever slipped. And it was this illusion he now worked to undermine, not by confrontation, but by persistence, because every day he remained unbroken, uncontained, unclassified. He forced the system to expend energy explaining itself, and systems built on exploitation collapse, not when challenged loudly, but when forced to account continuously. The first move came disguised as reform, a tightening of slave movement permits framed as protection against theft and disorder, a language carefully chosen to appeal to merchants while justifying increased surveillance, and Isaac saw immediately what it was, a net cast wide enough to catch him without naming him, and rather than evade it entirely, he stepped partially into its edges, allowing his name to surface in minor bureaucratic exchanges, correcting errors, submitting documents that were technically flawless, because he wanted those reviewing the files to recognize the anomaly without being able to act on it, to feel unease rather than certainty, and this tactic worked more effectively than disappearance ever could, because disappearance invites pursuit, while presence demands justification. At the same time, the informal network that had grown around him began to feel pressure, not through arrests but through warnings, employers cautioned, ships delayed, favors revoked, and Isaac watched carefully to see who withdrew and who remained, not judging either response, because survival under oppression takes many forms, and he adjusted his paths accordingly, redistributing risk, ensuring no single person became indispensable, because indispensability creates targets. What troubled the authorities most was not Isaac's intelligence, by now that was acknowledged privately, but his restraint, his refusal to either rebel openly or submit quietly, because restraint denied them narrative leverage, and without narrative, punishment becomes visible as cruelty rather than order. And so they attempted to provoke him, planting rumors that his actions had endangered others, that he had betrayed confidences, that he sought favor for himself alone, knowing that internal fracture would succeed where force had failed. But Isaac countered this not by denial but by transparency, sharing information freely, explaining decisions, admitting uncertainty where it existed, because trust built on honesty withstands suspicion better than loyalty built on fear, and the rumors lost potency, turning instead into proof of manipulation, further exposing the system's desperation. As summer deepened, a more direct strategy emerged, one that revealed just how threatened the authorities had become, because they began to circulate a new classification quietly among officials, a category not found in law but whispered in offices, a term used to justify exceptional measures, dangerously intelligent, and while it carried no legal weight, it functioned as a moral exemption, allowing those who used it to believe they were protecting society rather than enforcing domination. And Isaac learned of this classification through an overheard conversation relayed by a dock clerk whose hands shook as he spoke, because the label terrified him not for what it meant for Isaac, but for what it implied about the future. a future where intellect itself could be criminalized when attached to the wrong body. Rather than retreat, Isaac leaned into the implications of the label, becoming more careful, more precise, ensuring that every action he took could be defended, not only ethically but procedurally, forcing those who sought to act against him to confront the absence of formal grounds. And this restraint began to exhaust them, because maintaining vigilance without resolution drains authority, and cracks began to show as different factions disagreed on how to proceed, merchants resenting disruption, officials fearing precedent, slaveholders anxious that the idea of intelligence as uncontrollable might spread, and in this division Isaac found leverage, not by exploiting it overtly, but by remaining consistent, a fixed point around which their contradictions revolved. Yet the greatest retaliation came not from officials but from the system's logic itself, because as word of Isaac's actions spread beyond Galveston, carried by sailors and whispers, other enslaved men and women began to behave differently, not rebelling outright but asking questions, requesting explanations, noticing inconsistencies, and this shift, subtle and slow, terrified those in power more than any planned escape could have, because it suggested that intelligence was not an anomaly but a suppressed constant, and suppression, once questioned, requires increasing force to maintain, a cycle that history had already proven unsustainable. Isaac became acutely aware that his survival was no longer the central issue. Influence was, and influence carries weight heavier than chains, because it cannot be isolated easily, and as pressure mounted, he faced a decision that would define the remainder of his story, whether to seek definitive escape while the opportunity still existed, or to remain embedded long enough to destabilize the system further, knowing that the latter path narrowed with each passing day, because retaliation, when delayed, often arrives with greater intensity. The choice was not framed in heroic terms, but practical ones, because Isaac understood that martyrdom would serve the system by simplifying his narrative, while continued presence complicated it, and so he chose complexity, even as it increased personal risk, coordinating quietly with those who could carry fragments of his methods elsewhere, ensuring that if he were removed, the disruption would not end with him. The authorities, sensing this diffusion, escalated their efforts, convening closed-door meetings, drafting contingencies, discussing transport, confinement, legal maneuvers that skirted existing statutes, and Isaac learned of these plans, not through spies, but through pattern recognition, because systems repeat themselves when under stress, and he recognized the signs from histories he had studied, moments before repression hardened into precedent. As the net tightened, he prepared not an escape route, but a record, ensuring that documents existed in multiple hands, that testimonies were known, that contradictions were preserved, because even if he vanished, the questions he raised would not, and this preparation carried a quiet grief, because he understood that victory might not mean freedom in his lifetime, but erosion that benefited others, and yet this understanding did not weaken him. It clarified him, sharpening his resolve, because clarity under threat is a form of freedom the system cannot confiscate. By the time the order was drafted that would attempt to neutralize him, framed as transfer, review, relocation, the city had already changed in ways its architects could not reverse, because too many people had seen the system hesitate. Too many had heard an enslaved man speak law fluently. Too many had felt the ground shift beneath assumptions they once took for granted. And Isaac, standing at the edge of a decision that would echo beyond his own fate, understood that the final act of this mystery would not be about whether he escaped or was captured, but about whether the system could ever again claim that intelligence, once awakened, could be contained. And it is into that final confrontation, where legacy outweighs outcome, that Part 8 now moves. The order never arrived the way power imagines its orders do, crisp and decisive, because by the time the papers were drafted, revised, and quietly approved, Galveston itself had shifted just enough to make certainty impossible, and Isaac understood this before anyone else, because he had learned to read not only documents but delays, not only words but hesitations, and when the summons finally came, it was framed as relocation for administrative clarity, a phrase so empty it revealed everything, and rather than resist or comply outright, Isaac did what he had always done. He asked questions, not loudly, not defiantly, but precisely, requesting dates, routes, custodians, legal authorities, each inquiry slowing the machinery just enough to expose its improvisation, because the truth was, there was no clear plan for a man like him, only an urgent need to remove the discomfort he caused, and discomfort, unlike crime, leaves no lawful footprint. As the days stretched and the transfer stalled, rumors multiplied, some claiming Isa. C had already been moved in secret, others insisting he had vanished into the interior, and the authorities let these rumors circulate because uncertainty can serve as containment when action cannot. But Isaac was still there, still working, still speaking carefully, still preparing, because he knew that when power cannot resolve a problem, it often attempts to erase it indirectly, not through punishment, but through disappearance. And so he ensured that disappearance, if it came, would not mean silence. In quiet conversations held at thresholds and alleys, in notes tucked into ledgers and memorized rather than written, he distributed not plans but perspectives, teaching others how to read contracts, how to question terms, how to recognize when law contradicted itself, because knowledge that spreads becomes untraceable, and the more untraceable it becomes, the less effective retaliation is. The night before the final decision was expected, Galveston felt unusually still, as if the city itself were holding breath, and Isaac walked its familiar paths one last time, not in fear but in acknowledgement, because places, like people, carry memory, and he wanted to leave his intact, and when morning came, the transfer did not happen, nor did an arrest, nor a public declaration of any kind, and this absence became the most unsettling development of all, because systems rely on visible outcomes to reinforce authority, and here there was none. Over the following weeks, Isaac's name appeared less frequently in records, then not at all, and whether this was deliberate removal or quiet departure was never resolved, because those who knew did not speak, and those who spoke did not know, and Galveston adjusted as cities do, absorbing anomaly into routine while pretending it had never occurred, yet the effects lingered in ways no ledger could correct, because men who had once accepted their classifications without question now hesitated, merchants demanded clearer terms, clerks double-checked assumptions, and enslaved workers listened more closely, asked more carefully, carried themselves with a subtle shift that suggested they had seen something irreversible. Years later, historians searching through fragmented archives would notice the gaps, entries that ended abruptly, correspondence that referenced decisions never recorded, procedural changes implemented without explanation, and some would speculate about corruption or incompetence, while others would sense something more elusive, a disturbance not of order but of belief, because belief, once fractured, does not mend cleanly. Isaac's fate became a matter of conjecture, with stories diverging depending on who told them, some insisting he escaped under a borrowed name, others claiming he was sent inland and died anonymously, and still others suggesting he remained nearby, unrecognized, watching quietly as the world adjusted to the questions he had planted. And perhaps the truth is less important than the pattern, because what endured was not the man's physical presence, but the recalibration he forced, the realization that intelligence under bondage is not exceptional but suppressed, and that suppression requires constant effort, which is to say constant weakness. In later years, when emancipation came and narratives were rewritten to center triumph or tragedy neatly, Isaac's story resisted both categories, because it offered no clear heroics, no dramatic escape, no documented martyrdom, only a sustained insistence on clarity that exposed the system's fragility, and this resistance to narrative resolution made it inconvenient, and inconvenient histories are often the first to be forgotten deliberately. Yet forgetting is never complete, because echoes remain in practices, in reforms whose origins are obscured, in cautionary tales told quietly, and in the way institutions hedge their language when confronted with intellect they cannot comfortably categorize, and if you listen closely to Galveston's later records, you can hear that echo in the careful phrasing, in the new procedures that assumed competence, where once they assumed ignorance, because once a system learns it can be questioned from within, it cannot unlearn that fact. Isaac's greatest act, then, was not escape or survival in the narrow sense, but the creation of a problem that could not be solved without transformation. And transformation is the one outcome oppression fears most, because it requires admitting that the foundation itself was flawed. Today, when we look back at 1859 and search for the most intelligent man traded in Galveston, we are tempted to ask for proof, for documents, for names, for endings, but the absence of these is itself the evidence, because power preserves what it understands and erases what it cannot, and Isaac belonged to the latter category, leaving behind not a record of compliance or rebellion, but a trail of adjustments that testify to his impact more honestly than any proclamation could. And so his mystery remains impossible not because it lacks answers, but because it refuses containment, inviting us to reconsider what intelligence means under oppression, how resistance can operate without spectacle, and why some of the most consequential challenges to history occur not through violence or decree, but through the quiet insistence that logic applies universally, even when a system is built to deny it. If this story made you pause, question, or see the past differently, make sure you subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon so you never miss these untold histories, and leave a comment telling us how deeply this story affected you, because the mysteries history tried to bury only survive when we choose to remember them.